Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vicki Wilkins, Dean of the School of Public Affairs at American University, and I'm so happy to welcome you today to today's event. 7 days after the election, what happened? This is an event that is co-sponsored between the Kennedy Political Union, the School of Communication, and the School of Public Affairs at American University. So we say it's 7 days, but we realize that these 7 days have been like no other. And it definitely seems like we're dealing in dog years here. But I'm glad that you're going to have the chance to hear and learn from a set of amazing AU colleagues. Professor W. Joseph Campbell from the School of Communication, Professor Candace Nelson from the School of Public Affairs, Professor Lenny Steinhorn from the School of Communication, and one of our amazing student leaders, Amrutha Chatty, who is the director of the Kennedy Political Union. You'll have the joy of hearing from your moderator, Ron Elving. Ron is both known, of course, as a political analyst for NPR, but we know him in SPA as a beloved government professor and executive in residence. So, Ron, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Vicki. Thank you. And perhaps when we all met in October, those of you who were with us in October, we had expected, well, I'm not sure what exactly we expected. I think we predicted pretty well what the issues were going to be. And I think actually, looking back over what was said that day, there was a good deal of prescience from all the members of this panel. And I think we can feel pretty good about at least raising the right questions and having the right uncertainties highlighted from that early point on. I hope it was useful to those of you who were participants at that time. And we'd like to go back over that and see where we were possibly right, possibly wrong, or at least where we raised the right questions. And perhaps today we could begin to at least move in the direction of answering some of those questions. Now, I'd like to begin by going back to Professor Steinhorn from the Department of Communication. He has been involved in a number of campaigns over the years, in addition to his scholarly writing and his historical writing. And one of the things that he brought up back in October that I found fascinating was the concept that Trump was playing with House money. I'll let him explain that, but that he was in a position to use some of the excess electoral college votes that he had piled up. And after all, he got all the way to the exalted number of 306 back in 2016. He could lose 36 electoral college votes and still be reelected. And that gave him a certain amount of leeway so that even if he was not perhaps as exciting a figure to some of his supporters as he was 4 years ago, or if perhaps some people had turned against him based on his first term, he could still win. And that was not necessarily what everyone was saying back in October. And I think we should all salute the degree to which Lenny made it very clear that this was still very much a jump ball. Professor Steinhorn, how are you feeling at this point, looking over the electoral college map as we more or less think it's been settled at this juncture?
Well, thank you, Ron, and thanks to everybody for being here. Really appreciate you coming. On Saturday, I happened to be down at the White House reporting for CBS Radio News on this spontaneous victory right outside the White House, and we saw it in cities throughout the country. And what I saw and what I reported was a spirit of relief, of catharsis, redemption, deliverance after 4 years of division and demonization. One man was shouting, "This is what America's all about." I passed a smiling police officer who said, "How nice to see people happy again." And of course, the Democrats had good reason to be happy. Of that electoral map that they lost in 2016, they won back the blue wall that cost Hillary Clinton the presidency. They kept Nevada, which the president thought he could flip this year. And they appear to have flipped longtime reliably red states, Arizona and Georgia. The celebration on Saturday was completely warranted. But here's the thing, Ron, if you dig deeper, there should be some flashing yellow lights for the Democratic Party in the years ahead. Let's set aside the fact that they had illusions of flipping Florida, Texas, Ohio, Iowa, and North Carolina. They didn't, and in most of those states, they lost by significant numbers. North Carolina was a state they thought they had a chance. There's a higher number of college-educated voters there. Almost a quarter of the state is African-American, but they lost it handily. More important, while nationwide they won big among Latinos, in two key states they saw bleeding. We've heard a lot about Florida, But think about Zapata County, Texas, which sits on the border of Mexico and voted heavily for Clinton and Obama in previous elections. Biden lost it by 5 percentage points. Trump lost nearby Starr County by 60 percentage points in 2016. He only lost it by just 5 points this year. So that brings up a larger point. At that rally, people were handing out signs saying, by the people, for the people. And for years, the Democrats have been saying that if the people simply went out to vote, if turnout increased, they would begin to dominate elections, not only for the presidency, but down ballot in the years ahead. Yet turnout was arguably at its highest in over a century, and Republicans actually made gains in the House and held their own in state legislatures that the Democrats thought they could flip. So yes, the Democrats got people out to vote who hadn't voted before, but so did the Republicans, perhaps even more, and they seem to be slowly gaining traction among some key Democratic constituencies that the Democrats saw as their base. So Republicans began to turn out voters, and that was what we were predicting a few weeks ago before the election, that Donald Trump had a big turnout machine. Take away the Biden margin in California, and as of today, Donald Trump would have won the popular vote. So as much as the Democratic strategists think that the people will be more progressive, perhaps they may not be. But one final thought here, before the Republicans try to turn lemons into lemonade, let's not forget, they lost the presidency by a big popular vote margin, as they did in 2016. And they lost the Electoral College by the same margin that Donald Trump won in 2016, when he called it a huge victory, a landslide, and a mandate. So they may have made gains in the House, but Nancy Pelosi still controls it. There's still a chance that Democrats could win the Senate. And the Republicans may have locked down the rural vote, but suburbanites, young people, Asian Americans, and college educated seem to have abandoned the Republican Party in large numbers. And then there's Georgia, because that's where a concerted effort by Stacey Abrams and other activists, especially African American women, turned out the vote and seemed to be flipping that state blue for the first time since Bill Clinton did it in 1992. So maybe the Democrats are right. If they put the time, resources, and energy into turning people out, maybe the people will speak for them. Final note, Donald Trump turned out his base, secured 48% of the vote, and came close to capturing the Electoral College. Remember 4 years ago when everyone said that Hillary Clinton lost the election because of a mere football stadium of voters in 3 states that went to Donald Trump? Well, Donald Trump today can say the same thing. Add up the likely margins in Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, and the Nebraska 2nd Congressional District, and you get that same football stadium of voters that has now given Joe Biden the win. So Republicans have to evaluate whether it was Donald Trump who brought out these voters and whether they will stick with the Republican Party if Donald Trump is no longer on the ballot, or whether a less divisive Trump-style populist can still motivate these voters and bring suburbanites back into the party. Like the Democrats, the Republicans have a lot of soul searching to do. And to me, these are some of the lessons and questions from this election.
Well, thank you, Lenny. That was remarkably succinct and on target in my view. And before we go on to a second presentation here in just a moment, I'd like to give some of our other panelists a chance to get into the discussion before they make their presentation. And I'm going to ask Professor Campbell to offer up a question for his colleague, Professor Steinhorn. What struck you, Joe?
Thanks, Ron. I was struck by the even-handedness, the decided even-handedness of Lenny's presentation. And I'm curious to know how, Lenny, you think we are going to remember this election. Of course, we're just a week afterwards, but it was not a realigning election as many people had thought it might be. And how are we likely to recall this? It was not a Biden landslide as many people thought it was going to be. Is it a repudiation of Trump? Is that how historians are going to probably remember this? Is it going to be the pandemic election? Is it going to be the turnout election? Which of these characterizations, in your view, is most likely to stick, to be the ones that we remember when we look back at 2020?
Well, that's a good question. And it depends at what level of narrative you're talking about. If you're talking about it at the level of political strategists, you're going to be drilling down into the weeds and looking at any number of these issues. I think they're going to be looking at the Trump campaign as a potential model of how you turn out voters, get them enthusiastic, and message to people at a fundamentally emotional level. In 2018, what you saw was Donald Trump losing big, his party losing big in the midterm elections because he kept talking about caravans of immigrants and invasion of immigrants and all of sort of the nativist and xenophobic rhetoric. Did he repeat that this year? No, there was barely any mention of immigration this year. Donald Trump calibrated his rhetoric because they did the research and found out, for example, that any number of Latinos, especially in Texas, would be more inclined to vote for the Republican Party if they didn't hear that divisive rhetoric. So I think people will be looking at the Trump campaign sort of as an object lesson about how you can turn what appeared to be a losing cause into something that came very, very close to winning. I think that's what strategists will be looking at. But in the longer term, I think it's hard not to think about this being an election as basically the end of the Donald Trump presidency. He tried to hang on like a tick with all of these lawsuits and claim that he actually won it and do all of these whatever rallies and refuse to cooperate with Joe Biden on the transition. But the bottom line is his was an outsized presidency, outsized personality, sort of very, very critical moment in our history that people will be focusing on. And the very fact that more than 50% of the voters voted for his opponent and turned him away, I think in the long run, that's going to be the larger historical narrative of this election in which people evaluate Donald Trump, what he meant to American society, and the fact that even though the Republicans did not fall behind, and it wasn't a landslide election, as you said, Joe, that yes, Donald Trump, if he wasn't repudiated, he was defeated. And then where does the country go from here? And I think that becomes the narrative of this election.
Thank you both. Thank you both. That was a very amplifying effort to answer that question. And I think that you're wrestling with the things we're going to be wrestling with respect to what this meant for some while. Also really appreciate Professor Steinhorn making that mention of some of the smart things that the Trump campaign did, because I want to segue here to Candace Nelson, who is just completed her tour as department chair, as the government department chair in the School of Public Affairs, and is the author of many articles and books, including what I spent my morning teaching this morning, Campaigns and Elections American Style with James Thurber. And I would just like to say that I've never worked for a nicer person and a person it was more fun to work for. And I want to specifically give her a chance to talk about campaigns because she has made a study, made her focus the importance of campaigns. What did people do that was smart? What did people do that was a blunder in 2020?
Thank you, Ron. In May, the Trump campaign started talking again about the economy. And a lot of people criticized that, saying, you know, the economy's not doing too well. It's the pandemic. In the exit polls, voters were asked what was the most important issue to their vote. The answer that got the most votes was the economy. 35% said the economy. Of those who said the economy, 82% voted for President Trump. So I think that may be some evidence that his message got out there. Voters were also asked which candidate quality mattered most. Again, the answer, there were four. Again, the answer that got the most support was is a strong leader. 71% who said that is a strong leader was most important to them, the most important candidate quality. 71% voted for President Trump. So I think that may be a cautionary tale to some of us who are in the Washington bubble, that what we're hearing and thinking is maybe not what the country writ large is hearing. Former Vice President Joe Biden's message also got out there, though. Of those who said racial inequality was the most important issue, 91% voted for Biden. Of those who said the coronavirus was the most important issue, 82% voted for Biden. And of those who said healthcare policy was the most important issue, 63% voted for Biden. So I would suggest both candidates got their message out there. In terms of blunders, one question I think is what happened to the Trump money machine? It was expected that whoever won the Democratic nomination would face an uphill battle because of the money that Trump had raised. And he had started raising money almost the day after he was sworn in. Over the summer, former Vice President Biden overtook what President Trump was raising and outraised him late in the summer and in the fall. So I think that's an interesting question as to how that happened. And the third thing I would mention, and Lenny referred to this, is I'm not sure if it's a blunder or not. I don't think we have the data to know. But the Trump campaign ran a very traditional field plan. They knocked on doors, they called people. They really didn't change things much, despite the virus. The Biden campaign took a different approach. They didn't knock on doors, by and large. They called people on the phone. And I think it's going to be an interesting question to see if that was effective. I mean, the reason they did it was because of the virus. They didn't want people going and knocking on doors. So they had I think, a legitimate reason for doing it. But we know that the most effective way to turn out votes is to knock on doors. And the fact that they chose not to do that, I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Candy. I'd like to, at this point, introduce our student guest, our student panelist, Amrutha Chatty. I have taught at 4 schools. I've taught courses at 4 schools, and I have never had more fun than teaching the students at American University. And I must say, beyond American University, that this generation, the Generation Z, if you will, is extraordinarily exciting in terms of their political involvement, not just at American University, although of course we say we are the most politically involved campus in America with some evidence, but also because people under 30 turned out in this election in extraordinary numbers, and apparently because of their rather heavy preference for one candidate had a dispositive effect. So in salute to Generation Z and to the excellent students of American University, I'm Amrutha Chatty of the Kennedy Political Union. Would you ask a question of Professor Nelson so we can proceed?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask about what you were saying about the Trump money machine. We talked a little bit about, certain Democratic populations that the Trump campaign was able to take some votes from in Miami-Dade County. They even made some inroads with Black voters, even though those overwhelmingly turned out for Joe Biden. Do you think that it was a smart decision of the Trump campaign to do targeted outreach to certain Democratic populations? And was that an effective strategy for them towards the end of the campaign?
Yes, I think it was an effective strategy. And while the Biden campaign was putting money on the airwaves, the Trump campaign was spending money on digital. And I think that's where we're heading. I think we're going to see more and more campaigning done digitally, particularly to younger folks, to communities of color. And so I think that they had less money, but my guess is they probably used it pretty well.
There's every evidence of that. There's every evidence that they got greater bang for the buck too. And across the board, when we're looking at all these Senate races where the Democrats had an enormous financial advantage, including a campaign in South Carolina where they broke all records for 1/4 fundraising. And yet it did not seem to turn the corner. It did not seem to have enough effect. Even though it moved the polls, it did not necessarily move the votes in the end. Speaking of polls, you've probably heard it said that one of the greatest talents to have in politics is timing, knowing when to run. And I would say that the same thing could be said of publishing. And we're privileged to have with us today a guest who has just shown some rather remarkable timing in publishing a book about why we shouldn't trust polls. 2016 was bad. One could argue 2020 was worse. So Professor Campbell, tell us, how are we going to get past this poll fascination that we in the media and so many other people just can't seem to live without?
Thanks, Ron. short answer, we're not going to get away from this poll fascination. It runs too deep in American life and American culture and American politics, and it's going to be with us in 2022 and 2024. And if you want to chair a panel again in 2024, I'd be happy to participate in, and perhaps other panelists would too. It was another case of polling surprise. I mean, and I think we should stop being surprised by polls, because it happens often enough, not in every election, but often enough for us to be like, oh, wow, how come we didn't anticipate this? And one reason we have trouble anticipating polling surprises, polling failure, is that they are all different, almost entirely. Polling failure is kind of like Tolstoy's unhappy families. They're all unhappy in their own way. And polling failure takes place in its own way. And that's one of the themes of the book that you mentioned. And I thank you very much for doing so. It's titled Lost in a Gallop, Polling Failure in US Presidential Elections. And I'd like to draw on that book for a very brief PowerPoint presentation I put together for today. And it reflects the most recent election as well. So it's not just a rehash of the book. And I think it's important to keep in mind that it's important to keep in mind that the closing phrase of the book, Lost in a Gallop, has this to say: when polls fail, they can fail in surprising ways. It's the very last line of the book, and I think that's what happened in 2020. They failed in surprising ways. It was another polling failure. It was not the election that the polls told us to expect. It was not a blue wave election when Joe Biden leads the Democrats triumphantly into the White House by comfortable margins, that the Senate turns Democratic easily, and that the House of Representatives, the Democrats, enhance their majority. Some of that could happen. Biden's likely to become president. The Senate could, as Lenny mentioned earlier, could tip to the Democrats, depending on the outcome of Georgia Senate races, runoffs in January. But overall, we did not see a blue wave. We did not see a blowout. This election was the blowout that wasn't, and the polls led us astray in thinking that it might be. In fact, just a couple of hours ago, the senior polling analyst for Real Clear Politics, one of the best and most even-handed sites out there devoted to polls and politics, by the name of Sean Trendy, had this to say on Twitter. He said, the 2020 polling was a pile of steaming garbage. Okay, it's a bit crude, but the point's well taken. A pile of steaming garbage. So what happened in this election? And let's drill down for a few minutes into some data, a few data points, nothing terribly complex, fairly straightforward. And the first data point is the national election. And it shows that according to the Real Clear Politics aggregation of leading polls, that Joe Biden at the end of the campaign had a 7.2 percentage point lead overall. And he's likely to win this election by maybe 3.5 points, 4 points, something like that. It's not going to be close. It's not going to be 7.2 percentage points. And within that average, there are a number of polls such as Economist YouGov and Quinnipiac, NBC, Wall Street Journal. They had Biden winning by double digits, which qualifies as a landslide. So we had a number of polls pointing to and telling the American public that be prepared for a landslide that wasn't. And let's drill down at the level of a particular state, a real battleground state this year, as well as in 2016, Wisconsin. And the final average of the polls in Wisconsin showed that Joe Biden was ahead by 6.7 percentage points. I mean, that's a huge lead on election day. And yet he won that state by less than a percentage point. And some polls, again, were showing comfortable leads for Joe Biden, 8, 10, 11 points. In fact, the winner of the most off-target poll in 2020 has to be the Washington Post ABC News poll in Wisconsin, which less than a week before the election showed that Biden was ahead by 17 points. 17 points. Biden, as I say, won that state by about 0.7 of a percentage point. So this is a poll that was extraordinarily off, eye-poppingly off, if you will. And we can drill down to other places in other states. In Ohio, this was supposed to be a very close race. Real Clear Politics, on the average of polls, had Donald Trump ahead by a percentage point or so, and he won that state by 8 points. Again, the polls off, directionally off in Biden's favor. And we can also drill down on polling in various state races. The US Senate race in Maine in particular had Sarah Gideon well ahead, comfortably ahead of the incumbent Republican, Susan Collins. All the polls in Maine showed that Gideon was going to win this election. And yet Susan Collins, the Republican, wins by 8.8 percentage points. So why did the polls surprise us? Why did they go wrong in 2020? It sounds like a cop-out, but it's true. No one knows for sure just yet why the polls failed, why the polls gave us this misleading indication. It'll take months, but there are already some indications as to what may have gone wrong. When a huge turnout or a lower than expected turnout takes place, that can have the effect of throwing off polling estimates. And polling is often art as well as science. And one of the bits of science that go into public opinion polling is to determine, at least for election purposes, or to estimate what the electorate's going to look like, how large it is. And a large turnout as we had in 2020 likely threw off some of the polling estimates. So that is certainly one topic that is going to be investigated pretty closely. Another is, was there this shy Trump phenomenon? Did a huge contingent of Trump voters turn out after telling pollsters that they were not Trump supporters, or they refused to discuss their preferences with pollsters, or they said that they were undecided? The shy Trump phenomenon, which has it that Trump voters keep to themselves their preferences because of social desirability reasons, that it's not really all that great or to be encouraged to go out and say, yes, I'm a Trump supporter. They don't want to be seen as being supporters of a divisive character like Donald Trump. So this shy Trump phenomenon was much discussed in 2016. It returned in 2020 and is certainly one of the topics that is going to be investigated in this year's election as to how the polls and why the polls went wrong. And also response rates. Response rates for telephone polls, both landline as well as cell phone, have been in decline, dropping dramatically for many years. And now they're around 6, 7, 8, 9%. In other words, of 100 calls made to prospective respondents to polls, maybe 7, 8, or 9 of them respond. And you can see how that might have the distorting effect in polls. Now, pollsters say that they can adjust their data, they can statistically weight their data to account for a low turnout, a low response rate, but possibly response rates finally have influenced polls to the extent that they cannot accurately reflect what's going on in the country at this election, in the national election. So these are 3 factors. I'm not saying any of them is the factor, but they will certainly be looked at in the weeks and months ahead. There is going to be a period of soul searching for the polling industry, and it's certain that we'll not know for weeks, if not months, as to what really happened. The largest polling organization in the country, the American Association for Public Opinion Research, is going to be investigating this, just as it investigated the 2016 election. It took APOR 6 months, essentially, to come up with its report in 2016, 2017, and it's likely to be the same amount of time this year. It'll probably be in May of 2021 before APOR has its findings available. It's also true, too, that a counter narrative may emerge that says that polls, well, okay, they were off in some cases in some states, but directionally they were pretty close. They told us that Biden was likely to win, and that's what happened. And the polls really may not have been all that bad. And I think we're going to be seeing some of that, especially if Biden's margin in the popular vote continues to expand as mail-in votes out west are counted, and that can take a long time, and his margin, his advantage could increase. It could increase, and that would give ammunition to people who say that, to the counter narrative, to say that we were close, we were pretty close in the end, and some of this initial reaction was incorrect. So we might see this counter narrative. I think that counter narrative is exaggerated and extreme if it does emerge, but that is something we might anticipate. Also, the question that's been circulating since the election has been a question, certainly, will election polling survive? Or is this the end of election polling? Is this going to doom it? Back-to-back polling lapses, polling surprises, polling failures? Is that finally going to do in election polling? My answer is no, it's not going to happen. Polls will survive. And one reason is that the election polling is a slice, a small, comparatively small slice of a much larger multi-billion-dollar market research, opinion research industry. And lots of surveys are being done that have nothing to do with elections, consumer preferences, public policy issues, market-related research. All of this and other kinds of surveys are being done all the time, and those are not going to go away because of back-to-back polling lapses in presidential elections in this country. It's just simply not. Another reason why polling is not going to go away, election polling, is that it has deep roots in American culture and American politics. Researchers have found references to crude straw polls being conducted as long ago as the 1824 election between Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. And these reports were published in newspapers in Pennsylvania and North Carolina, which suggest a deep-seated and long-standing interest in opinion research and in the views of other people. So I think that'll continue. It's just too deeply entrenched in American life to be ripped out and to be doomed, actually. And finally, these are imperfect instruments, but polls, election polls and public policy polls, other kinds of polls do give us insight, and they do give us an explanation. And that is a non-trivial element of opinion research. So I'm sure that this is going to continue. This industry is not going to die away because of the back-to-back polling lapses in the last two presidential elections. So thanks very much.
Ron, you're muted.
Okay, thank you so much, Joe. Candy, I'd like to give you a chance to ask a question. Professor Campbell has given us a lot to think about. What are you wondering most as you look at the polls that you think you might address?
So Joe, you mentioned the response rate that's going down. We have problems with cell phones, trying to reach people on cell phones. We've got answering machines. We've got voicemail. So what do you think polling is going to look like, assuming it does survive? And I think you're right about that. Are we finally going to see internet polling? Is that going to overtake calling people on the phone? I mean, we used to have people go door to door and then widespread, phone use. So what do you think polling is going to look like going forward?
Andy, there's been a lot of experimentation in the field of election polling and opinion research in general, trying to find what is the next gold standard. The gold standard has long been random digit dialed telephone calls with live operators. And that became a feature of opinion research in the late 60s into the 70s, 80s, even 90s. And it was recognized as the gold standard for a long time. And pollsters were able to reach not only landline users, but cell phone users as well. So there was a great shot of getting a pretty representative sample until people stopped answering the phone because they didn't want to be harassed by telemarketers or other people, scammers, what have you. And that has helped drive down the response rates to, as I say, about 6, 7, 8, 9%. And you can see fairly quickly how expensive that becomes to try to get a decent sized sample when you have like maybe 1 in 6 or 6 out of 100 or 7 out of 100 people responding to your calls. That becomes very expensive, very time consuming, and very frustrating. And with that kind of response rate, we're not sure we're really going to get a good sample that's going to be representative, even if you weight the hell out of it, if you statistically adjust it as pollsters do, and that's a legitimate function of polling. So it's widely regarded in the polling industry that telephone random digit dialed live operator calling is going to go by the boards. That is no longer going to be the gold standard. And what is next is the real big question as you posed it. Is it internet? Is it internet-based surveys? Could be. And the Pew Research Organization here in town does a lot of work with internet panels. They recruit probability panels via the internet, and these are respondents they go back to periodically for polling questions. So there's a lot of work being done in the field. People are using robocalling, trying to make use of text messaging via cell phones. None of this seems to yet have emerged as the next gold standard. None of this is really on the cusp of becoming widely accepted and widely recognized as the next valid and reliable way to do opinion research. So there's a lot of churn, there's a lot of upheaval in the field, and I expect, Candy, that's going to continue for the next 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 years.
Very well. I think that gives us a lot to chew on, and looking forward, asking some of the questions that you've asked about our technology and some of the questions we've asked about the way we think about elections. Let's talk about someone we hope will be around for a lot of elections beyond the rest of us, and someone who I think can speak for that generation I was admiring a moment ago. Amrutha, please tell us a little bit about what you see ahead for American politics.
Yeah, sure. So I think you actually mentioned a brief while ago, youth turnout was up a significant amount from 2016. I think about 10 to 12% they're estimating right now, with I'm sure more clear numbers coming out later. And I think there is a few factors to that. The biggest being, I think Professor Nelson mentioned about the future of campaigning being digital. And I think that so many campaigns down ballot neglected to reach out to youth voters. And I would even say voters of color who get a majority of their information from the digital sphere. Something notable was that I would say early in the summer, I think pre-George Floyd, there was not a lot of movement for voters of color and for young voters, especially registering or getting excited or getting ready to turn out to vote. But I would say after the Black Lives Matter movement and after those protests and demonstrations took the world by hold, youth voters especially began to register, began to decide how to turn out, how to vote. And I think that was the most powerful messaging by the Biden camp, was make a plan and vote and actually show up, because we did. And I think that has been the biggest question mark. I've even doubted whether people in my generation were going to show up to the polls. They always say they're going to. We saw it happening in 2016 where everyone's saying we're going to actually get out there, we're going to vote for Hillary. But then we didn't. And I think this time we've actually shown we're capable of showing up, we're capable of making our voices heard. And I think it made a really big difference for Biden. Looking forward, I think we are in a very divided country right now. I think the celebrations were fantastic. I know my sister lives in Philadelphia and she had a great time participating in the celebrations there. But I also think that we have to recognize it's not just a party, it's not just a country divided into two parties, it's a country divided into, I would say, 4 distinct divides, with I'm sure even more amongst that. I think one of the largest stories has been the infighting in the Democratic Party with moderates versus progressives, which has been a storyline we've been seeing since AOC and Rashida Tlaib got elected, and the squad, and sort of bringing their more progressive ideas. And I think where youth voters are going to be very frustrated is with moderates blaming some of the loss of down ballot seats on progressives, which we heard in that phone call that got leaked to the press. And I think what's frustrating about that, especially to youth voters, is they turned out in the places that they needed to. I think what's especially frustrating is they did not want Joe Biden to be at the top of the ticket, but they came out and they unified because that's what they had to do. But they didn't get outreach from the moderate candidates who they needed to be turning out for down ballot. They weren't being reached out to by people like Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania or Abigail Spanberger in Virginia. And then moderates are scratching their heads and wondering why. So I think that's one big divide right there, is within the Democratic Party itself. But I think if we look on the other side in the Republican Party, we're also going to see a divide there. I think right now we're seeing quiet whispers of people who have congratulated President-elect Biden. We see people who are wondering whether Trump is going to run in 2024 or what the future of the party is going to be. And I think we're going to see a further divide of conservative voters, of those who want to stay on the Trump train and those who are quick to get off and move on now that he's been voted out of office. So I think moving forward, what we're going to see is 2 parties who are having a hard time coming together and unifying. And I think that they have to just shift their strategies, both of them, because youth voters are clearly coming out to be a powerful force in elections. I think we make up about 15 to 17% of the electorate. And if the parties can't get themselves together and find solid messages on either side, they're not going to be able to control that electorate at all.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting. Professor Steinhorn, much to further this discussion, but do you have a question for Amrutha first?
Yes, so Amrutha, your generation turned out in what would have been a landslide if it were only under 30 voters voting in this election. But you're in our election class, and last week on Thursday, we had a conversation, and you brought up the question of, my gosh, about half the country voted for somebody who arguably expresses racist or bigoted views in many ways. So your generation, under 30, may have voted 2-1 or close to it for the Democrats and for Joe Biden, repudiating Donald Trump. But ahead of you are still lots of Americans who voted the other way. So in some ways, the larger question is, where does this leave your generation, realizing that there may be a disconnect from where you are with much of your lives ahead of you versus where a lot of other Americans are who are voting in fundamentally different ways, in a way that startles and surprises so many of your generation?
I think, and I brought it up in class last week too, is that it depends on the issues that all of the populations find most important. And I think for our generation, it's issues like racial inequality. Professor Nelson mentioned that those who listed racial inequality voted for Biden overwhelmingly, if that was their most important issue in voting. But if it's something like the economy, those people voted overwhelmingly for Trump. And I think where our generation is getting frustrated is we have different priorities because we see the issues intersecting in a way that I think older generations maybe don't. I think something that has been the conversation across Instagram, across Twitter, across all the platforms that our generation uses the most has been, you can't have a working economy if people of color are not working in that economy because they are a heavy part of it. So we see these issues as intersecting, as being a part of one another. You can't solve racial inequality without solving economic justice at the same time. And I think where we're getting extremely frustrated is, one, with all the people who voted for Trump and feeling just so heartbroken that there wasn't a complete repudiation of the more bigoted comments he made, the more divisive comments. But also, a lot of us voted for the Democratic Party at the top of the ticket. And right now we're seeing people like Representative Spanberger, like Speaker Pelosi, not wanting to get in line with the things that the youth voters are prioritizing. And I think that's where we're getting really frustrated, especially is, youth voters of color turned out for Democrats and helped them win this presidential election. And it almost seems like they're trying to ignore that, trying to move past that because they're frustrated with some of the results.
Ron, you're muted.
You're muted.
This is what I'm doing to try to cut down on the background noise from around my house. And so I keep getting reminded there is that noise, so I should mute, and then comes a moment that I should unmute. I'm having a bit of a flashback, Lenny, to 1972 and the re-election of Richard Nixon when he carried 49 states. You want to talk about a younger generation looking up at the people that had just voted and elected Richard Nixon for another term in the middle of, well, not the middle, but at the later stages of the Vietnam War, which we thought our generation had won some sort of repudiation of, and here's Richard Nixon defeating the anti-war candidate 49 states to 1. What I'm saying is I can feel your pain, Amrutha. I mean, it is difficult to be young and passionate in a time when the country is not necessarily moving in your direction as quickly as you would prefer. And I would suggest that it's at least somewhat reassuring to think that it might be moving in your direction, and that your generation voted a good deal more heavily than some of the earlier first-time voter generations have done. Other thoughts? I'd like to take some of the questions that we have from the audience. That doesn't seem to be too terribly many, but But other thoughts that some of our other panelists have on what Amrutha has shared with us before we move on.
You brought up the 1972 election, and this may be completely apocryphal, but there's that legendary supposed quote by the New Yorker film critic, and whether she actually said it or not, it's the larger point that's important, which is, how could Richard Nixon have won? Nobody I know voted for him. And so part of it is that we end up in our own silos, whether they're silos of media, silos of culture, silos of peer groups. And so again, I'm sure that there were lots of Trump people who felt, how could Joe Biden have won? You know, I don't know anybody who voted for him. Or how could Donald Trump have done so well? I don't know anyone who voted for him. So I think part of what Joe Biden did on Saturday night, and one of the most important statements he made, is that we not only have to talk with each other, but we have to see each other. We have to be able to humanize and understand what makes each other tick, because we can't have a democracy if the element of back and forth, either persuasion or understanding or reaching across the aisle, doesn't exist. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be able to step outside of our own perspectives and understand where people are coming from, have those conversations, but as Joe Biden said, to see all of the other people who may not have voted that way. It doesn't mean you have to change where you're coming from, but it does give you more of a 360 degree view of what our society and our democracy is. And I think ultimately in the long run, unless we want to be sort of this sort of centrifuge in which everything is pulling apart and going in different directions, where we have to be able to find a way to do that. And some say that Joe Biden may be perfectly positioned for this, because this has been part of his perspective and standard operating procedure for years. But then that doesn't address Amrutha's point, which is that if he does try and find a way to work across the aisle, that may alienate a core base of young people and progressives. And will they understand what he's trying to do, because just about half the country voted for Donald Trump and voted the other way?
I want to get one question in here and there are a number of questions about polls from our participants. And we'll get back to that, and we'll get back to Professor Campbell. But I want to ask what one of our participants is asking, and I think a lot of Americans are wondering today. We're hearing so much from the president about fraud, and we're hearing from other Republicans, maybe not so much the word fraud, but the word challenge. Let's find out. The president is within his rights, the Senate Majority Leader says, to challenge the results of this election. Do we think that there are real question marks about this vote count? Is Pennsylvania still in play? Could Georgia, with such a small margin, maybe 10,000 votes, could a recount turn Georgia, or for that matter, Wisconsin, with about twice that many? Does anyone see any realistic possibility here that the courts or the recounting are going to reverse the results in any of these states?
No.
Ron, I think your point about let's find out is very telling. And I think, why not find out? We have the time. The votes are not going to be certified for a few weeks yet. And the history of presidential elections in this country is not without some taint. 2016, Hillary Clinton claimed that she lost the election because of a criminal conspiracy between Donald Trump and the Russians. And that was investigated in great detail for many years. And I don't think we should lose sight of that recent historical example. Also in 2004, exit polling signaled that John Kerry was going to win the presidency. And many people thought that indeed was the case, that Kerry was the president-elect, but had the election stolen because of irregularities in places like Ohio. Harper's Magazine gave a detailed cover story to this story about irregularities in Ohio, and was the election of 2004 stolen? In fact, there have been books written about this.
That's right.
So the history of suspected fraud and tainted presidential elections is fairly deep and recent as well. So I don't see why not. Why not find out? Why not investigate? Why not? And I don't think we should completely write off the fact that, well, there doesn't seem to be anything there, because there could be something there. And I do think we owe it to ourselves, to the political process, and to this election to really find out.
No, I don't think anyone is suggesting, Joe, that we not.
And there is precedent for doing so.
I do understand that. I do understand that. Go ahead, Lenny.
Yeah, let me agree to disagree. And yes, there have been contested elections. You go back to 1960 with all the potential shenanigans in Texas and Illinois. And yet Richard Nixon, with what I would argue is probably one of the most or only noble things he's done, was willing to concede at that point. But when you go look at all of the evidence, there is and has been no evidence of election fraud. George W. Bush had a panel dealing with election fraud. They didn't find anything. Even Donald Trump's commission, which really was haphazard, didn't find anything. So I do think, yes, the president has every legal right to be able to do that. But if we go on and question every single election because we do not want to come off as a loser, then it really does potentially harm our democracy and our faith in the election. There is no evidence that these civil servants and these volunteers did anything other than count the votes. And even when you look at some of their lawsuits that have been put forth, they're a trivial number of ballots that wouldn't decide it one way or the other. And the 2016 recount that Jill Stein paid for in Wisconsin basically changed about 300 or so votes. You could say that Hillary Clinton didn't have to concede in 2016 because of the same number of voters that are being alleged in the case of Donald Trump right now could have flipped, but she didn't, because there is trust that the institutions do work and the election was run as smoothly as it could have been, and the professionals were doing their counting. And in fact, in Pennsylvania, it's a Republican who's in charge of that of the vote count, and he's been getting sort of messages and emails of people saying, you know, the Second Amendment is designed for people like you. I just don't think that's healthy for our country. But that's not to say that people don't have the right to question it. They have the legal right. But what does it do for our democracy in the long run?
Well, you know, we lived through this Russia collusion scandal, or that came a cropper, and 4 years ago, and I think that you know, the country was not well served by those extreme allegations, quite frankly. And so if even though Pulitzer Prizes were given to leading newspapers for their reporting on that, but I think if we ignore the suspicions and just say, oh, there's nothing there, then I think we're doing a great disservice to the election, to the body politic, and to the future. So we have time. Why not look at them? And if there's nothing there, we'll find out soon enough.
Just in fact, Lenny, if I could, I just wanted to get back to Candy for a moment here. After the initial question that I asked, you were not undecided, and you felt that there was not a lot of validity, which was actually, the question was not whether or not we should look into it or whether or not we should challenge, but whether or not there was validity in what we have seen alleged to now. You didn't seem to have much time or take much time to come to a conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear. If there was anybody else who was the president, this would not be happening. And we've seen it not just in the election results, we've seen it in the GSA has not let the administration, the Biden administration, start to look at, you know, begin the transition. So there's, Lenny mentioned in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, the two Republican candidates for the Senate called for the Republican Secretary of State to step down because of their concern about how the ballots were being handled. So this is not, you know, this is not 1960. This is 2020. And just to suggest that there's something going on that could change the result. I mean, I agree with Joe. People want to look at it, file lawsuits, go ahead and do that. But I don't see this changing the results of the election.
It's not like
I want to get one more question.
I think we should, you know, keep in mind, it's only been 7 days. So it takes a while for this kind of evidence to accrue, if it does accrue. So we have time. Let's look into it.
Right. So I want to get another question in.
May I just add one other point? And again, Joe and I always have nice discussions and conversations, but the Mueller report garnered 199 criminal charges, 37 indictments or guilty pleas, and 5 prison sentences. So I think we have to keep in mind that there was a there with all of that. And it may not have risen to some of the conspiratorial thinking, but there was a there.
There was no criminal conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia to steal the election. That was a bottom line finding of the Mueller report.
All right.
And that was a principle.
All right, we're not going back to the Mueller report, guys. We're not going to do that. What we're going to do is we're going to get in one more question. And I want
you asked the question, Ron.
Well, I asked the original question. Amrutha, I'd like to give you a shot at this one too. How do you feel people were influenced in this election by the media choices that they made? I know that the media were working hard to create certain impressions, but how much do you think this was a matter of what people chose to put in their media mix, their feed?
I think it's the most pivotal thing in the election is where do you get your information from? And I think that's what leads to the disbelief by people on both sides. Trump supporters are buying this narrative that the election was stolen because from the information they were getting, there was absolutely no way Joe Biden was going to win the election. And for liberals and Democrats, we've been getting information from MSNBC, CNN, where we're looking at those polls that Professor Campbell pulled up. And so there's absolutely no way to us that Trump even gets close to the White House again. So I think where people get their information is huge. And I think further than just, mainstream networks and media on TV and ads, we've been talking about the digital space. And I think that is where information is being peddled the most. People who spent money on Facebook, campaigns that spent money on Facebook, are those that succeeded the best because that's where people tend to get their information from these days. And so I think it's everything about where you're getting your facts. Facts I'll put in quotation marks because facts are now being put into question, and what you understand as a fact is changing depending on where you're hearing it from. And I think everything comes down to what you are being told via social media, via television, and so on.
Do you think, does anyone think that the media had a different kind of effect on this election from what we have known them to have in one way or another, going back a century, more than a century, since we first had voting in the United States? Was there something unique to the 2020 impact of the media? So we're just keeping at it the way we have. We've been trying to put our thumbs on the scale since the 1790s, and
well, in terms of polling, Ron, there's some suggestion that media coverage could have the effect of dampening turnout.
And polls themselves,
right. And journalists will report the polls because that's how they understand the elections. But if it seems like a candidate is certain to win and has an overwhelming advantage in the polls, that may have the effect of depressing turnout for that candidate. And some people think in 2016, that's what happened with Hillary Clinton, that some of her supporters didn't go to the polls and didn't vote in key states. It's also a possibility in the 1948 Dewey defeats Truman election when Harry Truman was supposed to lose to Republican Tom Dewey, and Dewey's supporters may have stayed home because it looked like, according to the polls, that this election was over before it began. So it may have that effect.
But we got such an enormous turnout though, up 22 million minimum, maybe 25 million from the previous record. So it doesn't look like anybody was really suppressed, does it?
No, certainly not. Certainly not. It took advantage of mail-in polling, I think.
I think it's where people are getting their information from. As Amrutha said, it's divided. It's not like it was, 40 or 50 years ago when there were 3 networks and everyone listened to Walter Cronkite. So there's so much media out there that people can get their news where they choose, and they tend to choose news that reinforces their own beliefs.
And I also think that to go off of Joe's point earlier, that as polls get less and less reliable, that doesn't mean that the journalists rely less and less on the polls. And so what happens is that the journalists continue to rely on the polls. There becomes this sort of herd mentality narrative that develops, and it creates a set of expectations that people may have that really can distort the lens through which we look at an election. As Amrutha knows, I kept warning the class, don't pay as much attention to these things, because look at the turnout operation of the Trump campaign and how they found sort of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of voters in key battleground states who weren't college educated, who hadn't voted in 2016, who they were registering and urging to vote. And so I always say that, you know, if we let reporting via polling narrative is an easy way to do journalism. And I don't think it's the best way to do journalism. And there's a lot more granular information that I do think journalists need to look at. But you know, you're on deadline, everything's rushed. The media company that sort of pays your salary invests a lot of money in a poll, and you're there to report it. And that becomes a self-perpetuating cycle of expectation that I think is very, very unfortunate.
Yes, I do recall in the Persian Gulf War back in 1990-91, a producer saying, well, if we can't get the usually reliable Kuwaiti newspaper, you may remember that phrase, which got to be quite a fixed phrase, a usually reliable Kuwaiti newspaper. And this producer said, well, if we can't get the usually reliable Kuwaiti newspaper, what are the other ones? Give us something. Give us something. If we don't really know what's going on, who claims they know what's going on? And that's where polls come in. And polls give us a sense of data, a false sense of security, a false sense that we're being factual and objective and political scientists, when in fact, the utility of social science research is maybe not reflected in the way we apply that general technique, the random digit dialing, to the specific problems of polling on Donald Trump, who does seem to be a special challenge for the polling industry. It looks to me like that 52 number, that most of the polls that you showed, Joe, had Biden right around 52, 53, 54. And in the end, he's probably going to be what, 52 and 5, 52.5, something like that. It's not the Biden number, that's all. It's the Trump number. The Trump.
Well, it's also the margin, Ron.
Sure, I get that.
Final margin going to be 7 points? I don't know. I doubt it.
Yeah, but no, I doubt it too. That would be Obama 2008. But where he is going to be is Obama 2012. And that's also, you know, a respectable margin. Where they're wrong is not in the number of people who claim to be voting for Biden. It's in the number of people who claim to be voting for Trump, and that's way too low. And that's a special problem. So, Matt, you tell me, are we on our time here, or do we still have some time to take some more questions? Well, if I'm not cut off, I would probably tend to continue. We do have a question here about whether or not the parties are ever going to get their messaging right to the various variations of the Latino or Latinx community. How much of a problem is that for Democrats that they don't seem to be able to differentiate very well among different groups?
It's a big problem. Amrutha mentioned it earlier, and it's not, it doesn't go back to 18 when AOC and others were elected. It goes back to 15 at least. And some might argue it goes back earlier. So, I mean, there was sort of a hold put on progressives and moderates. They agreed that their one goal was to defeat Donald Trump. I remember Bernie Sanders saying on Meet the Press that that was his goal, to defeat Donald Trump, but on November 4th, he was going to start to have a conversation. It ended up not being November 4th, a few days later, but that discrepancy within the party is still there, and we're going to see it play out over the next months, at least.
And Ron, I think there's a phrase that's very common in the progressive culture and even the Democratic Party, people of color. But one of the most interesting nuggets of information I saw in one survey was a significant number of Latinos don't want to be considered people of color. In fact, there's a varying sense of identity in terms of associating with immigrants from Europe to people who just simply want to be seen as Americans with small businesses and families and not people of color. And I think the progressive side of the Democratic Party really has to reckon with that concept, because built into that concept is a set of assumptions about people that, even though Amrutha, you use the word intersectionality there, there's that built-in assumption of similar worldviews or similar political perspectives. And if the Democratic Party continues to go down that path, it risks doing to large numbers of Americans exactly what they say the Republican Party does, which is to dehumanize them, to take away their agency, to take away who they are and what they're really thinking, and not necessarily to drill down at that granular level of understanding all of the hopes and dreams and aspirations of different demographic groups in this country. So again, I think that has to be a bit of soul searching in the Democratic Party to start to figure that out and to start to sort that through, which isn't to say that minority groups didn't vote Democratic in large numbers. They did. But this election suggests, as you saw near the Rio Grande River, that it's not all locked in, and there may be opportunities for Republicans if the Democrats don't figure out a better way to communicate and to understand.
Do any of you see a great deal of improvement through efforts such as Braver Angels or Better Angels, I believe is the name of the organization, that's sponsoring events to get people to listen to each other and not just talk at each other? Do you see any of these organizations or any of these civic efforts producing some improvement in terms of our atmosphere?
I can jump in here because I think that the point I wanted to make as well about, you know, Latino voters and that whole population is that I think that the nature of politics has, like Professor Steinhorn says, dehumanized different populations. And I think the lesson that's being learned in the hard way is that various communities of color are not monolithic. The Latinx community is not all the same. The Asian community are not all the same. And even the term Asian is so broad because there are South Asians, East Asians, everyone is just grouped into one big lump. And most of the time, that's what politicians do as well. Even if you watch Joe Biden's victory speech, Asians got one nice line thrown in there. Latinx voters got one nice line thrown in there for their efforts. When in reality, these communities aren't all voting the same, aren't all thinking the same, are extremely diverse and monolithic. And I think the only way that you can start to break down this idea is by looking into those numbers and learning more about what are the differences in communities and how do you not target them as if they all have one thinking mind, but understanding that people are different. If you can break down the white population into different demographics with people with different interests, you can do that with all the different populations in the country as well.
Absolutely. Amrutha, I believe you had the last word when we wrapped up our October session, and you did a marvelous job at that time and a marvelous job again today. Thank you very much for your contribution. And I want to thank all of our panelists and all of our hosts and the Schools of Communication, School of Public Affairs for sponsoring this event. Thank you all for joining us again. I hope that we've been able to bring together some of the thoughts that we left you with in October and carry them to the post-election environment. Surprises, yes, some things perhaps we shouldn't have been surprised by, and maybe we'll be that much wiser moving ahead. 2022 will be here before you know it, and right after that midterm election, there'll be candidates in Iowa and New Hampshire, I guarantee you. So, peace everyone, and thanks for joining us here today.